Digitize and Punish is a comprehensive study of the use of digital technology in American criminal justice. Brian Jefferson shows how the technology has expanded the wars on crime and drugs, enabling our current state of mass incarceration and further entrenching the nation's racialized policing and punishment. After examining how the criminal justice system conceptualized the benefits of computers to surveil criminalized populations, Jefferson focuses on New York City and Chicago to provide a grounded account of the deployment of digital computing in urban police departments. This conversation between Jefferson and University of Minnesota Press senior editor Pieter Martin was recorded in July 2020.
Hello, Brian.
Hi, Peter. My name is Brian Jefferson, and I'm an associate professor of geography and geographic information science at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign.
Yeah, and my name is Pieter Martin. I'm an acquisitions editor at the University of Minnesota Press, and worked with Brian to publish his new book, Digitize and Punish. Brian, I think maybe just to start things off, before we kind of get into the book itself or the argument of the book, I know you have a kind of sort of an interesting path to the project itself. I mean, first of all, you're a professor of geography, but you actually didn't train as a geographer, right? You were did a PhD in political theory, and this project actually wasn't based on that dissertation research itself. So tell me a little bit about the kind of the roots of the project, and kind of how you came to it.
Yeah, so my degree was, as you said, in political theory, and so I've always been really interested in the state and thinking about state power.
Yeah.
My dissertation was on the NYPD, and it was about the sort of the stop and frisk debate in the early 2010s. And what I was looking at was sort of the way that activists were trying to get the stop and frisk policy and broader issues about police accountability and police misconduct, how they were strategizing to try to change those things. So I was thinking about it mostly in terms of the politics and the sort of grassroots, but also professional activism that was mobilizing to try to get some of these policies changed. But then I just, out of sheer happenstance, ended up being a geographer, which made me think a lot more about space and a lot more about the ways that policing constitutes and reproduces and sort of governs and differentiates spaces and cities. So the project, it sort of, you could see there are little vestiges of the dissertation in it, especially when I turn toward more the activist at the end. But the bulk of it is, I guess you'd say, urban geography and looking at the way that neighborhoods are differentiated, but with a keen focus on the government.
Yeah, yeah. No, I mean, your book is obviously looking at a range of technologies of law enforcement, everything from computers to ankle bracelets. But really, I mean, at the heart of your book, I think, is really the relationship between data, new technologies of kind of collecting data, of instrumentalizing it, and as a way to kind of control space, right? And I guess promulgate what you call sort of racial criminalization.
Yeah, oh, definitely. There's a lot of attention, rightfully so, of course, on cameras and ankle bracelets. And I became really interested in sort of where all the information from these different technologies is deposited and centralized. Oftentimes they're called data fusion centers. Um, but in doing the research for the book, I almost got this impression of these data centers becoming almost like wardens for people's communities, because
Right.
they had, yeah, they had access to all these different types of data, which they could be locational data from bracelets, they could be video data from cameras, they could be criminal record data from being someone being booked and charged, or from the courts. So the data in the data center sort of, for me, emerged at the center of all of these different technologies, which was something that I didn't really see coming into it, or but it just emerged through the research, and I got really interested in sort of how do these data centers function, and how do they extend the carceral state sort of out into the street more.
Brian, early in the book, you obviously kind of give a short, kind of longer history of the relationship between law enforcement and the kind of rise of data, kind of in the pre-computer age. You obviously, I think, look at J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI and the kind of rise of sort of modern database policing. But really, I mean, I think the book kind of it's really these sort of interesting parallel developments in the late 60s, early 70s between the rise of the mainframe, or at least the kind of adoption of the mainframe and computing in the larger society, kind of parallel to these moments of urban unrest during the 60s, the prosecution of the Black Panther movement. I mean, that's kind of an important sort of starting point for the book in some ways. Is that correct?
Oh, definitely. Yeah. So in the 60s, the 60s, of course, are really almost like this romantic period that I've studied a lot, from the side of civil rights unrest, uh, for the most part, and the Black Power movement. But in reading for the book, I had to read more about when computer science really establishes itself, and then sort of the slow history of computers becoming affordable and accessible, and spreading throughout society. So there's like this dual process that became really interesting to me, where you were seeing much, you might say, like today, like technological advancement on one hand, and social unrest, and massive sort of egregious forms of inequality on the other hand. And one of the things that really interested me in trying to wrap my head around was sort of how you could have these two contradictory processes going on. One that looks like, a very brutal, police suppression of political dissidents, on one hand, and then on the other hand, scientific progress. And then sort of where do those two strands intersect? And I think in looking at something like the LEAA, Lyndon Johnson's law enforcement, you get those two strands, they intersect, and you see that the police are starting to adopt, the cutting edge technologies of the day. And I think the thrust of the book is, what did they adopt the technologies for, in the 60s or the 70s or the 80s? And if they're still using those very same technologies today in similar ways, and extending the way that they use the technology, to what extent does that reproduce or perpetuate the war on crime and the war on drugs, which we might tend to think is over. But my argument is, it's just sort of been normalized and made banal through these sort of automated technologies.
Yeah, I mean, the book really I mean, I think there's definitely these sort of fascinating kind of points where the adoption of computers and data really get accelerated. Part of that, I think you refer to the war on drugs, but this sort of the militarization of the police force in some ways, right? And we see that both with the war on drugs. We also see that kind of in the post 9/11 era.
Mhm.
Um, and then also, in the early 90s with the sort of broken windows policy of New York, right? And I know also, like, your book obviously is looking at this sort of broad national development of these technologies and adoption of them. But New York and Chicago are really the two focuses of it. And of course, New York really, with the broken windows policy, was kind of the most, or at least maybe the most celebrated application
Mhm.
of data in some ways. Is that a fair way to put it?
Yeah, yeah. And in specific New York, their ComStat system, which comes online in 1994, and it's been depicted in The Wire. I think The Wire actually did a really interesting job of depicting it. But their ComStat system, which is short for compare statistics or computer statistics, depending on who you ask, um, but it was a system in which the NYPD wanted to hold their commanding and rank and file officers more accountable for their performance, i.e., the arrest rate and also the crime rate. And so they were tracking officer performance, through databases, and they were also using digital maps to track where crimes were happening. And I think it seems sort of like a boring, bureaucratic, administrative application of technology. But what it did is it, created these quantified quota systems for police to make arrests and to intervene in people's everyday lives. And as the technology became more sophisticated, their behavior and their performance was tracked in more sophisticated ways. Um, so New York City was, as the crime rate drops going into the late 90s. So they were seen as sort of a model of how to use technology to drop the crime rate. Now, of course, there are a million different factors that could lead to that crime rate dropping, especially the demographic changes, the different classes and wealthier people coming in to the city. But nonetheless, they were seen as sort of the exemplar of how to use technology for policing.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, Brian, you have these parallel case studies that, New York and Chicago, and I'm sort of, how did Chicago's experience, I mean, I guess sort of mirror New York's, or I mean, were they sort of following New York's lead? And I'm sort of just curious how the kind of your selection of case studies worked out.
Yeah, well, it's funny. They were similar in a lot of ways and different in a lot of ways. Chicago, in some ways, was ahead of New York. Illinois was one of the first states, and Chicago used actuarial tables in the early 1900s. Uh, and Bernard Harcourt, he writes a book against profiling, which does a great long history, going back to the early 20th century of using probability tables to try to predict which juveniles would relapse. So, and that's in Chicago before New York. And then Chicago also was using digital mapping, I found in the late 80s, not on a department wide scale, but they were using it for the war on gangs during the 80s and the early 90s. From the mayor's standpoint, the adoption of technology for the police was used in very explicit martial terms. It was very explicitly done to give the police an edge in what was seen or often talked about as a war, as a literal war in some cases from some public officials. Um, in New York, it's a little bit different. It's adopted more under the idea of applying sort of like private sector streamlining and efficient ways of management or modern management theory, applying that to the police
Mhm.
department to make it more efficient and to make it, just operate smoothly and to be able to cut out some of the redundancy, bureaucratic redundancies. So they're very different in that sense in sort of the contingent circumstances in which technologies were first rolled out and really promoted by public officials. But what became very clear that was similar between the two was the relation to the IT sector and the relation to what would eventually we would come to call data scientists. Uh, and
Yeah.
so a lot of the book sort of in the course of studying that relationship became, I think, a focal point between, how did IT companies, large and small, link up with urban police and criminal justice agencies. So that sort of became one of the core pillars of the book.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the role of capitalism, right, and the role of these sort of technology companies as sort of developing a market, right, for these technologies, and obviously there's maybe a chicken or it's which one's the chicken, which one is the egg, right, in terms of were these state agencies looking to develop new tools, were these companies coming to the government and pitching them these sort of flashy new technologies as a way to kind of further manage their law enforcement efforts. But there's a long history of that, and I think I remember one part of the book is that people often cast prisons as this place where the sort of for-profit part of the economy has sort of developed these businesses that are only cause more incarceration in a way, right? But you kind of make this argument that we should also look at these data companies as well, right, as a sort of form of capital that is really problematic.
Yeah, definitely. So the book in many ways was an attempt to try to apply what was discovered by people like Angela Y. Davis and Ruthie Gilmore in terms of the prison industrial complex.
Yeah.
And I think they created sort of a model, for looking at criminal justice and looking at racial criminalization from a little more of a political economic standpoint, and looking at the different corporations that are involved, and then starting to think about how those corporations try to actively influence criminal justice policy, right? And because they have a rational economic interest
Right.
in criminal justice laws being harsher. Yeah. So the book was, in my mind, it was the task was, well, how can I take this model and explore a different relationship, and that being IT companies. And I think when I started uh, 4 years ago or so, I think that a lot of people, and I think you see journalists and now scholars and definitely activists are seeing these connections. One of the goals with the book was to really draw the connections between, okay, there's also, as like you say, a sort of for-profit niche market for surveillance, and that could be for financial headquarters in the city, which people like Stephen Graham, I think, have written really greatly about this sort of fortified surveillance urban space. But I wanted to look at these neglected and marginalized communities, and see how IT companies had found profit frontiers in these communities as well.
Yeah, because we often think of downtowns, right, as being these sort of heavily surveilled spaces with cameras and various forms of kind of, surveillance. But yeah, I mean, talk a little bit about how these technologies expand out into the neighborhoods. Can you sort of paint a picture of the landscape of a urban neighborhood, of people of color, and how just the range of technologies that are sort of following them on any given day?
Yeah, and I don't think it's the picture would look as coherent and clear as if we looked at a downtown wealthy city center. I don't know that the digital architecture or infrastructure for surveilling these marginalized communities is as thick and as well planned out. I think it sort of arises in a more sort of contingent way. But and one of the sort of fears of the book is that it will become more coherent and thicker.
Yeah.
But in these communities, you have it's a hodgepodge of technology. So you will have your cameras, your CCTV cameras,
Yeah.
um, in public housing
Yeah.
sometimes. Yeah. And that's an important thing that I try to stress, that of course surveillance society affects all people. But one of the things is, but what neighborhoods or what housing areas have cameras inside the housing unit. So that's one. The electronic ankle bracelets, of
Yeah.
course, and those have been written about. I like James Kilgore does a great job of that. And then you have the mobile command centers, like in the case of New York City, where they had these retrofitted buses that essentially were criminal processing vehicles, where people could get booked right on the street. The patrol car, one of the things that I argue in the book, is as the squad car gets linked into the criminal database, and in some cases the mobile phones that patrol officers have video feeds. We could think of the patrol car or the squad car as almost like a mini mobile command center
Yeah.
that's roving about. And then you have all of the different software for analyzing and predicting who's going to commit crime. And this could be predicting individuals, or it could be predicting areas of the community. But then, it goes on, and that sort of, it was a challenge to figure out how to manage all of this for the book. But I look in New York City, and there's like the fiber optic cabling that the NYPD had its own proprietary system or network that connects all of the public housing units to police precincts and police headquarters. So you have that, and it goes on and on. And what you see is just like a tremendous sort of investment on behalf of the cities, also in New York, data storage that they have in the Verizon towers, right? So they need server space, they need cooling equipment, not to mention the shot detectors, shot
Right.
spotters. So there's just all of these different technologies, and if you're a small or a large tech company, you're of course going to want to sell your product, and they'll always be pitching new ideas to police departments to expand their arsenal, their digital
Yeah.
arsenal.
Yeah. I mean, I think a great line of your book, because I think there's always been this sort of political consensus around the adoption of new technology in law enforcement, right? I think there's a line, maybe in the introduction or maybe the first chapter, that you talk about, for the political right, it sort of allows them to be, distant and separated from these communities that they find problematic. And for the left, it allows this sort of a scientific rationalism, right, that they buy into, right? I mean, I don't know if that's maybe a slightly distilled way of putting it, but there's been a consensus for a long time around these technologies, right?
Hmm. Oh yeah, yeah, definitely. And that's one of the things I try to stress. I mean, I start sort of with Lyndon Johnson's administration as one of the key turning points in the convergence between computer technology and criminal justice. It's a very sort of typical story of liberal left-leaning faith in technocracy, and in the idea that you can fight crime in this very scientific, neutral way. And we also even see this in the Obama administration, where there's a famous task force study that the administration does on the future of policing, and it's really technocratic, a really sort of technophile approach to solving the problems of racism. So I think it's really important to show that this is not simply a story of the evil segregationists, or the evil anti-crime, anti-drug coalitions in in the 80s, trying to exert control over these disenfranchised and marginalized people. It's also a story of having a faith in technical solutions and scientific solutions to social problems, and also and trying to enjoin us to think a little bit more about who designs the software or the technology, and what is their main interest, and how does that position them vis-a-vis the war on crime or the war on drugs.
Yeah.
So I definitely wanted to stress that it's not this binary thing where it's the conservatives running roughshod over the liberals. This is a story that is really propelled in many cases by um, liberal technocrats.
Yeah, yeah. The I know I can tell revisiting your book that you're a fan of science fiction. You're also, I think, very careful, I think, to maybe avoid a sort of painting too kind of dystopian of a picture. Although, at times it does feel pretty dystopian, right? I mean, you're sort of careful about that.
Yeah.
I mean, do you wrestle with, I guess, sort of these questions, I guess, of sort of technological determinism and making sure that you're sort of creating a genealogy of these new technologies, but also I think being very clear about the politics and the ideas of the people who are using them. In other words, right? I mean, but did you find that challenging at any point where you didn't want to give the technology too much agency, even while you're trying to kind of create this sort of larger web of new developments and new adoption and just the whole history of it.
Oh yeah. I mean, I think you are probably one of the people who helped me with the technological determinism and looking at some of the earlier drafts, and it was definitely something that everyone who read the earlier drafts pointed out. I think what happens is, especially when you're reading these technocratic and documents, and you're reading a lot of advertisements from companies for surveillance cameras or for whatever crime prediction software, it's almost easy to reproduce their sort of pitch, which is this technology is all powerful, and it can reduce crime by X%, in Y amount of days. So when you're reading these type of documents for years at a time, I think the author almost unconsciously picks up some of the ways of seeing and talking about technology that the companies and that the government exemplify. But I do think in many ways, especially in the 80s and 90s, almost like a trove of speculative fiction in talking about a lot of the issues that we're talking about in the mainstream today. I find a lot of science fiction to be really ahead of its time in talking about issues, especially about the relation between science and society. And one of the things I find interesting in a lot of sci-fi is you can tell there's a lot of amount of research done on actually existing technologies and technology that are on the horizon. I think that sort of research, which is just like academic research, I think makes for a strong foundation in a lot of speculative fiction. But the sci-fi and the sort of scientific dystopian genre, I think, is more of it's a warning.
Yeah.
And one of the things I've been reading more recently about our surveillance in China and doing my research for my book, a great fear is that we might be closer than we think to that type of system, especially if you look at like Uyghur containment. So
Yeah.
I definitely wanted to raise alarms with the book, but like you say, there's always this balance of not having this completely deterministic view.
I know you mentioned this briefly in the book, but it sounds like your archives, so to speak, the materials that you put together, that some of it really came from, how do I put it, unnamed activists, people who have sort of uncovered. I don't know how much you can talk about that, and maybe hopefully I'm not misrepresenting it, but you were able, some of the material in the book you were able to kind of obtain from maybe sources that weren't so public. Is that correct?
Well, there were government
Yeah.
sources, which uh, a lot of them were just available online. You can go
Yeah.
to, Chicago Police .il.gov or whatever it is, or New York. Now, a lot of those materials are being taken down in the last year or so, and I noticed that. But and then there are a lot of course, activist organizations. I think were super helpful in doing their own studies, oftentimes in collaborations with academics. So those were great sources. And then I had police accountability activists as sources. So it takes on sort of a myriad different sources of information. One of the ironies is a lot of them were from the government. They were from the state. It was just a matter of me trying to interpret their objectives and then a lot of their arguments from a different perspective than, of course, the police or the criminal justice system would.
Yeah, where I could imagine maybe some of the corporate, trying to get inside some of the corporate, just bodies of information was probably a little bit more complicated.
Yeah, well, that was, but I would say the data scientists that I interviewed were more than happy to talk about how brilliant they were,
Yeah, yeah, I can
and their
imagine, right?
technology. Yeah, so they were some of the some of the best, especially right around after Ferguson, and that sort of wave of debates and discussions and protesting. What I found back then, a lot of them were saying, well, our technology is the antidote to something like Michael Brown's murder.
Right.
Now I think their tune has changed a lot now because what's happened in the last 5 years or so, or just the public sphere, again, journalists, news outlets, activists are starting. Everyone is really starting to put this technology under a microscope, and you're starting to see, I think, a lot of the data scientists retreat or think a little more critically about the relation between their technology and the social consequences.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, the past several months, of course, here in Minneapolis, as you know, have been, or last couple months, I should say. I don't know time. I'm losing a sense of time now in the pandemic, but the George Floyd's murder and the aftermath of that was obviously puts some of the issues of your book in kind of high relief. For me, it was sort of fascinating to kind of revisit the days following, I mean, of course, George Floyd's murder itself and the way it was captured on and distributed by phone. And of course, your book is really looking at the sort of top down, the role of technology in law enforcement. And of course, there's this sort of fascinating bottom up response to that and the way in which a kind of counter surveillance program now going on with of the police and of their actions. And of course, George Floyd's murder is just kind of the latest of that, and a video that, frankly, people, regardless of people's political stripe, pretty much everyone, can see that it was, horribly unjust and tragic. I mean, are you the sort of counter, the sort of the way in which technology now is almost the kind of resistance against, the over policing of America, sort of is kind of a fascinating mirror image in some ways, right? And it's not a focus of the book per se, but is that something that you've been exploring?
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean the conclusion is just about the sort of use of technology to turning it against the technology creep of the digital sort of carceral state. And the conclusion is actually titled "Viral
Right.
Abolition," and that goes back to my grad school research with grassroots activists, and this would have been the early 2010s when a lot of people were really starting to put footage of police misconduct and brutality onto YouTube. Um, One of the groups I worked with, they had this entire well organized counter surveillance strategy where they had squadrons, they had teams of people who would go out with cameras or with their phones, and they would just record police civilian encounters, whether completely benign, and then they would store the video footage, and if anything happened, that ran afoul of law, they would post it. And so there was that. There's in Chicago, there's the police misconduct, the Citizens Data Project,
Yeah.
which is the largest, or at least when I was studying it, yeah, so database of police misconduct in the country. Uh, so the definitely the end looks at the bottom up. If I could go back, I think I probably would have more consistently throughout the entire book looked at the bottom up, but the conclusion definitely looks at it, and it just was from my observation. I never thought, I don't think anyone thought that the protests would explode on like a global scale this past summer like they did. That was completely caught me off guard. And I think most people, but I think it was almost a confirmation of what I saw on a much smaller scale. And it reinforces the fact that technology is in many ways like a tool, just like a hammer is a tool, and you can use it for multiple things, destruction or building.
Yeah.
It just matters sort of who's wielding it, yeah, and sort of what are the objectives that are set forth. Um, so, I do think the silver lining in this summer of protest is the unimaginable potential and power that there is in people using the network, using the internet, using images to organize against government overreach. I mean, I was talking to some younger high school kids and earlier this summer, and was saying, well, why do you guys think the protests were so grand in scale? And they said, we were sitting at home during the pandemic, and we just saw these issues, these images, right, of injustice, and we decided to do something because they were sitting in front of computers, and that's sort of and seeing these images over and
Yeah.
over, and I think sparked a global moment.
Yeah. Yeah, here in Minneapolis, with the in the aftermath of 3 or 4 days of really, when the protests turned pretty, violent, or there were certain elements that unfortunately, burned a lot of buildings. It was
Hmm.
fascinating to kind of revisit that moment through the prism of your book, because they've arrested a couple people. Based on their social media accounts, and these are people who
Hmm.
weren't peacefully protesting. I mean, they were doing bad, but it was fascinating. There's also the story of the federal drone that was observing the protests. But it
Yeah.
really makes you. I mean, it kind of rose to the surface the way in which a whole range of people were probably being surveilled. Do you see? I mean, we're in this fascinating moment where how we're going to transform policing, right? And places like Minneapolis are taking this objective really seriously, although it's at a very, very early stage. And part of that, means potentially less policemen, like less people policing the city. I know that's something that's going on in Minneapolis. They want to change the charter to quite literally,
Mhm.
there's like a mandated threshold in terms of the amount of people per capita on the police force, and they want to get rid of that. But, is there do you see any concerns that there's going to be more and more sort of investments in technological fixes?
Actually, my former advisor, Alex Vitale, his book "End of Policing" was about essentially defunding police and looking at Minneapolis. When I first saw that was in the public sort of debates, it was pretty surprising from outside looking in. That was one of the of course, solutions that's being proposed. And so I do think, in terms of police reform, there will be sort of more pressure to reallocate public
Mhm.
funding. You can call it defunding the police, or you call it reallocating, public revenue to more social services. Um, but whatever it is, I do think that it's more than likely that there will be an element of sort of relying on technology, even for social service systems, to deliver them more efficiently and in a more streamlined fashion. But I think one of the maybe more the, a good thing that you see now, I think, is that more people are looking very critically and scrutinizing these new technologies that are being rolled out. So of course you see this with contact
Right.
tracing, and trying to contain the pandemic. So I do think there will be more technology, and that will be sort of one of the ways that people will go about trying to reform and perhaps downscale policing. Um, but at the same time, I do think the public is much more aware and interested in looking at how these technologies are rolling out, and what sort of unintended consequences they might
Yeah.
bring. And that's a lot different than my book, because when I was researching, especially stuff in the 90s, um, and even early 2000s post 9/11, the public, we weren't really privy to, I think, the adoptions of these sort of complex infrastructures, and it's taken almost 2 decades, if not more, for us to catch up. But I think we have. So I think the debate is guaranteed to
Yeah.
continue.
Yeah. So, the inquiring book editor always wants to know, I mean, what's next for you?
Oh, well, yeah, I'm going to look at the relationship between the IT sector and the state,
Yeah.
but I think on a broader scale, and more generally, because that was sort of on the urban scale, something that just really came out of the book, like understanding this relationship, and one of the things that the book sort of pivoted mid writing, where I decided this should be more of a historical story, where I went in, a theory degree,
Yeah.
and everything was all, very abstract. But yeah, but the adage that history is, well, I guess we could say, change into history is stranger than theory, because the sort of little anecdotes about deals between New York City and IBM, or the Verizon building in New York City, and the NYPD. These became really, for me, digging up these anecdotes and these stories, I think gave me the most sense of discovery, and saying something that hadn't been, or finding things that haven't been really studied before. So I'd like to scale up, and to think more broadly, that it's not a lot of it's not bashing the IT
Yeah.
sector, but the interesting thing for book one is, the IT sector, at least the stereotype of Silicon Valley is multiculturalism and
Right.
libertarianism. So I think book one problematized the multiculturalism part. So book two will problematize the libertarianism. So by looking at how the state has helped actually propel the growth of the IT sector, and how the IT sector propels the growth of the state.
Yeah. Or does it propel the maybe dismantling of parts of the state too? I don't know if that makes sense. Is it a,
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
it's sort of the privatization of previously kind of, state services and that kind of thing.
Oh yeah, and opening up new ways of resistance to what we were saying earlier.
Yeah, that's exciting. Well, is there anything else you want to just sort of say about your book? I'll just say I'm really pleased to have been able to work on it.
The book is Digitize and Punish, uh, Racial Criminalization in the Digital Age. And it's looking just at the history. I try to take more of a historical approach, but just looking at the history between computers and the criminal justice system, over a longer, I think, time period than is usually looked at. So, these are definitely debates, and I'd like to think of the book as almost a toolkit, more of a giving these historical moments and the precedents that have gotten us up here to this point. So, if you are interested in questions of surveillance of the state, and especially racial inequality, I hope you'll find something useful in it.
All right. Well, thanks a lot, Brian. And again, it's a great book.
Thanks a lot.